This is Dialogue, a weekly conversation where creativity meets technology. This episode of Season 1 is brought to you by Astropad and Hello. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You know, Federico, last week we concluded our conversation with screenwriter John August, who wrote the Arlo Finch trilogy of novels for middle grade kids. And that was our first chance to talk to someone who's written a novel. And I know that we both wanted to hear more about that process. And, you know, that's something that we'll continue to explore and learn about in terms of the writing side of things. Mm-hmm. But we also wanted to check out what exactly it's like to write for video games. Because I think that's like one of those things that people don't really necessarily know, that there's a lot of writing that goes into making a video game. You know, people think about the graphics, they think about the sound, they think about the action. They don't necessarily, I think, always think about the writing side of it. And that's something we wanted to talk about a little bit today. And so we have with us today Carrie Patel, who is a narrative designer at Obsidian Entertainment and also a novelist who's written the Recoleta series of novels. Welcome to the show, Carrie.
Thank you very much for having me.
I wanted to get started with the video game side of things, if we could, Carrie, because you're a narrative designer at Obsidian Entertainment, and I was wondering what exactly is narrative design in video games?
So it takes different shapes at different studios, and at Obsidian, we combine the role of narrative designer and writer into one. Some studios separate those. So together, those disciplines encompass, you know, at a high structural level, you know, thinking of what's the story for the game, and then also, you know, at a lower level, writing the dialogue for individual characters, writing, in many cases, whatever player-facing text is going to appear in your game, but also thinking about, you know, how the mechanics the player is experiencing are going to influence their perception of the game, and how to create a story that meshes well with that. Because I think, you know, people talk about narratives and story in games, and they think about plot almost exclusively. But narrative design is really about what is the experience the player having, what experience is the player having, and what story is that creating in their mind about who they are in the video game world and what they're doing. And that can include, you know, the emotions of either excitement or horror that they feel at a particular experience, and either the power or the vulnerability they feel, depending upon, you know, what kind of character they're playing.
So, Carrie, can you tell us a bit about how you got started writing narratives for video games, as well as some of the games that you worked on?
Sure. So at the time that I applied to Obsidian, I had been working on novels and short fiction for for a while, but focusing more on that for a couple of years. And I was really interested. I mean, I'd been a gamer growing up, and so I always enjoyed playing games, and I enjoyed a lot of the stories in games. And so I knew, you know, someone was writing these things. So after a couple of years, I was really interested in looking at career options there, and then working on something where I could, you know, still be a writer and a storyteller, but in a more collaborative environment. So they just so happened to be looking for a writer and narrative designer for the first Pillars of Eternity game at the time that I started looking around. And so I applied and was really excited about the studio's focus on narrative, and got the job that way. So to answer your other question, I've worked on the original Pillars of Eternity, the White March expansions. I was narrative co-lead on Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. And most recently, I've been working on The Outer Worlds, which is coming out soon.
Yeah, I cannot wait for that. Sorry, the fan in me just speaking out every once in a while. Yes, we're going to talk about that later, maybe.
We will, yeah. I'm looking forward to it too. Go ahead, Federico.
I wanted to ask you, so when you start, I want to know more about the process of designing the narrative for a video game. So what does it look like when a game just started development, formally speaking? Like, are narrative designers part of that process right away, right from the beginning? Or is the narrative and the story and all the other elements surrounding the the environment where the player is going to experience the game? Do they come in at a later stage? How does that work from a timeline perspective?
And that's another thing that is really going to vary from one studio to another. Ideally, and fortunately at Obsidian, because so many of the games we make are very overtly tied to stories, we're known mostly for RPGs, which, are the kind we make are very story focused. At our studio and at some others, yes, narrative and story are part of the process from the beginning. A lot of times you'll have a set of, a game director and a set of leads who specialize in different disciplines, like, your systems design, narrative design, your art lead, and all these, and programming, obviously. And so you'll have these disciplines sort of brought together. There at this point is already a high level pitch and vision for the game. And so, then, the process is a little different from one game to the next. But, these people will kind of hash out together, like, okay, well, what is the player experience going to be? What kind of combat are we going to have? How is the player exploring the world? And, what's this game really about? Is it about, do we want to give the player, the experience of exploring a big open world, or, the experience of, following these very tightly crafted levels through some very carefully placed combat encounters? What's the experience there? And part of that is going to be, and what story are we telling the player? What's the plot of that story? Who is the player character in this world? So again, ideally, this question of what the story is and who the player's inhabiting in the game, that conversation is happening at the same time as, what are the mechanics? What's the scope of the game? What's it going to be like to play this game? But you do very frequently, again, not at Obsidian, but elsewhere, have the issue where story seems to come in last, and so maybe there's a very vague idea of, you're playing a soldier in this setting and time, or you're going to play a hunter in this setting, and so there's a very high level idea of what the story is and what the player experiences. And then, once the levels are mostly designed and, the combats are being tuned, someone pulls in a writer and says, okay, now write the script. I think that is a fairly common experience. And, to the extent that I think some video game writing has a tendency to be known to some people as this thing that just sort of gets pasted on to, a bunch of cutscenes that get pasted onto a game you're playing. Yeah. I do think a lot of it comes from story being treated as an afterthought. But, I definitely say that narrative is always being crafted for, a game that anyone's making. And it's really just a question of, are you acknowledging it and being intentional about it?
Right. It seems to me that when you do it that way, if the writers come in kind of late in the game, it strikes me that at that point, really what you are doing is you are kind of fitting the story to what's come before, as opposed to creating a story in a more collaborative way with the people who are doing the programming and the art direction, all that sort of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is. And the story that you're asking someone to craft may or may not really be very compatible with the experience the player is having. I think one sort of critique you see in a lot of games is it's like, I'm playing this, really sensitive, introspective, person with, deep thoughts and feelings, but I'm running around murdering a small country. And it's not that obviously can't have a game with combat and a game with, introspection and deep emotion, but you really have to think about, well, how does the story that we're trying to tell the players sync with the experiences that we're giving them to play through?
Right. That makes a lot of sense to me. You said that when you started Obsidian, you were looking for a collaborative environment to practice your writing skills. In what way is it collaborative? I mean, we've talked a little bit about how the process works in developing the story as part of the game, but are there other narrative designers that you work with on a particular game in collaborating with them, or is it more collaborating with the other components of and other people who make up the different components of a game?
It's both. So we do have I guess, a fairly sizable writing team on our games these days, which makes sense because there's a lot of writing in them. So on the first Pillars game, we had a few different people doing companion writing, but the core writing team was maybe a little bit smaller. It was my direct boss at the time, Eric Finstermaker, myself, and then we had a couple of area designers who were also very capable writers who would pitch in for some of that. And then for Deadfire, fortunately, we expanded our writing team, and we also have a similarly sized writing team for The Outer Worlds, which is very helpful just because there's so much content, in all of these games, and you
Sure.
want to make sure people have the time to work on it. But so that is part of it, but also yes, collaborating with other disciplines, to understand how the content you're working on is, going to fit with the rest of the level and where that level is placed within the rest of the game. And there are very real questions too of, well, here's a conversation I want to write, and here's something that I want to have, let the player do, or something I want to have an NPC do or say, but is it possible? You look at a game like Pillars where it's, an isometric perspective, and you're fairly distant from the player character and the other NPCs in the scene.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a certain amount of, gesture and expression that you can write in the prose surrounding the dialogue into those conversation exchanges that will, and I think Shadowrun Hong Kong did something very similar. You can write some of that stuff that we can't see because we don't have, a cinematic camera. But then you also have to say, like, well, but then there is too much. Like, an NPC, we can write them, waving their hands and gesticulating, to show their emotion. But, maybe we cannot write them dashing across the room. We might be able to script that in a cutscene, but, that also costs resources and, generally sort of pulling control away from the player to make them, watch an NPC path across the screen is not, the most engaging experience in most cases. So, even very simple stuff like that, obviously, it really serves not only any narrative designer, but, any designer in games, obviously, from any discipline, to be very collaborative with the other departments they're working with and to understand how to make the most of their work based on, the constraints of the game, the constraints of the engine, and also, how to help others really make their work shine by doing the same.
Sure. Yeah. It strikes me as one of those things too, narrative design, as being tricky to balance exactly how much, especially when it comes to, I guess, the written words on the screen, how much of that to include or not include to avoid a game being too much about reading and more about doing, how do you strike that kind of balance between player interaction and player, I guess, teaching the player what's going on and through written cutscenes or dialogue or whatever it happens to be?
So some of this is going to be based on the convention of the game you're working in. And in an RPG, for instance, I think there's the expectation and acceptance on, for many players that there's going to be a lot more writing because these worlds are going to be more heavily populated with characters. There's a lot of lore that may exist in, whether it's in-game, books, the Elder Scrolls series must have an entire library of, readable in-game books. And I'd be very curious to know what the total word count of those is. But these things are things that, players expect to see to some degree, even if they're not, going to read every single piece of it. And a lot of this is opt-in, right? So sometimes the text is there for people who want to read and engage with it, but, you're not generally going to miss anything crucial if you're not reading all the lore books, obviously. And there's a similar principle that holds true with for writing dialogue for NPCs. And generally, when we're structuring a dialogue, we try to make sure that there is a path for players who just kind of want to get the information and move through it quickly. And again, the exact conventions and how close you want to cut to the bone on this will vary from one game to the next. But yeah, generally try to include a path that's, fairly obvious. Look, just tell me what I need to do. Yeah, I'll do it. Show me where to go. Where the NPC can give the player exactly what they need, without breaking a naturalistic, conversational flow, but also without perhaps digging as deeply into, the issues, the lore, the deeper concerns that are being discussed in the conversation. And I think also being deliberate about the way you're letting the player engage with the NPC and with the conversation is really important. And I think that's a more nuanced thing to figure out and do well. For instance, there's at one extreme, there's listening to an NPC monologue at you and clicking continue, continue, continue. And I think we would all agree that that's not really fun as a player. Ideally in these conversations, the player has a sense that they're really engaging with another character, that they're, that if there's an issue being discussed, like, it's, oh, well, this noble is conscripting a lot of troops for this war, and, this is what it's costing their families. But I mean, I don't know, we can't afford to lose, and then the player has an opportunity to weigh in and say, like, well, yeah, I agree. I think you're right. Or, no, well, what about this? The player has an opportunity to engage with both the quirks of the character and also, the issues that are being discussed. And that also, I think, can be, making sure that the options you provide the player are flavorful and let them role play and demonstrate personality and, say something meaningful is important. I think one thing you see a lot is just a lot of sort of tell me about this, sort of question nodes. A question node is what we use to describe that hub in a conversation where you have the opportunity as a player to ask about a lot of things or say different things.
Right.
And, if an NPC is just saying, oh, will you help me find my lost dog? And your options are, where is it? What color is it? When did you lose it? You kind of recognize those are all things you have to ask. There's, you're not really getting to role play in an interesting way there. So it's better to just have the NPC say, I was walking my dog yesterday. It's a, brown terrier and I lost him in the park. Can you help me find them? Okay, then you have the player has the information they actually need to do the quest. And now you can afford to spend those player response options on things that are going to be interesting to the player and that will let the player role play instead of just like demand more information to solve a quest.
Right, because then you feel, you kind of feel like you're walking your way down an outline, and it feels a little too mechanical, I think.
Exactly.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Astropad Studio. Astropad Studio turns your iPad into a completely customizable graphics tablet. With Astropad, you can combine the power of the Apple Pencil with your favorite Mac apps right on your iPad. The makers behind Astropad understand that no two artists work alike. That's why they've packed Astropad with opportunities to customize every aspect of your workflow, with features like programmable gestures, custom pressure curves, and unlimited per-app shortcuts. They literally designed Astropad from the ground up for professional artists. Astropad also guarantees low latency performance over Wi-Fi or a USB cable, so you can set up your workspace on the go. It's a high-performance tool for the most demanding creative work, and today, Astropad is used by major animation studios and product design firms across the globe. So, if you're ready to take your creative workflow to the next level, you can start your free 30-day trial of Astropad Studio today. Visit astropad.com to get started. Again, that URL is astropad.com. Our thanks to Astropad Studio for their support of Dialogue. I want to switch gears just a little bit and ask you about trailers because, obviously The Outer Worlds is coming up soon and there have been a couple of trailers released. And that's, obviously that's something that happens with all games that are about to be released. And I was just curious, how do you get involved in the creation of the trailers at all in terms of, how much of the story are we going to reveal and that sort of thing?
The creative leadership team on the project definitely does. I was not involved with the creation of the Outer Worlds trailers. I believe that was, mostly our game directors, Tim and Leonard, and, our communication director, Mikey Dowling, and Buddha Jones, the company that put the trailers together. And I will say we got incredibly, I don't want to say lucky, because Buddha Jones obviously just knew exactly what they were doing. But we really did luck out with them, with that company, and with what they were able to do. I think we've all seen video game trailers that, don't really leave much of an impression.
Mm-hmm.
And they really managed to nail, the sensibility and the fun of the game that we were trying to build, which is, ideally what you want. I remember when they showed us a rough cut of the trailer that they released at the Game Awards, and, all of us kind of, gathered in the lounge, and we're thinking like, yeah, we've seen trailers. Okay, what's this going to be like? And we were all floored because it looked amazing, even before they had, the final art and everything in. So yeah, ideally what you have is, the creative leadership of your game, your design team expressing, to the people who are making the trailer, which if you're at a very big company, maybe they're internal. If you're not, then, you may be outsourcing, which obviously makes it harder to, communicate all these very specific things about, the feel of the game you're making, the tone of the game, like what you want players to come away with, what you want them to get excited about. And I think it's, kind of like a movie trailer, in that you don't necessarily want someone walking away thinking, I know the entire plot of this movie or game. You want them walking away thinking, I know how this will make me feel, and I'm excited about that. Like, this is a feeling I want to have, or it's not if you're not the right market for it. But that's what you should come away with, and I think that's a very tricky thing to nail down, and obviously very wonderful when someone does do it.
So I'm curious about the process of writing and designing game lore. You mentioned this a few minutes ago about the Elder Scrolls series. What does it look like in terms of designing a universe and a backstory, and all these other characters and all these readable elements, all these different components that make up the lore of a game? What does it look like in practice? And I guess, what are the challenges involved with making everything consistent and making everything feel that that makes sense, but it's not too much in the way? Sort of, how do you balance all that?
Yeah, those are really good questions, and I think the consistency is really hard, especially if you are trying to design something big and fairly expansive. And it has been very interesting, both on the Pillars team and now on the Outer Worlds team, getting to see the creation of and take part in the creation of new IPs in original worlds. Yeah, I think what is the lore of the world is one question, and then how much of it, in what manner do you communicate it to the player, is a second one. Mm-hmm. And I think recognizing that second question, that, yes, there may be a lot of information here that's sort of in our heads, or, things that we have assumed about the world. And then being very honest about, but how much of it does the player really need to know, is really important. Because I think, a lot of times it is very easy to bog players down and to smire a gaming experience in, just sort of dumping all the things that you're very excited about on the player, which, is something that I think you see in a lot of speculative fiction as well. Obviously not all of it, but, the one of the dangers is a tendency to say, here's the world I've created, and I'm so excited to show all of it to you. Mm-hmm. I'm going to start info dumping it on you, instead of giving you, a forward-moving experience in this story and in this game. I don't know. I mean, I think part of that is recognizing, what is the purpose of these different lore tidbits? Like, how will it serve the player to know this information? And, what does this enable? What does this enable us to do in the game, or, explain or hand wave in the game, that's important to the gaming experience? And I think, that's another thing where, even in games that have a lot of pre-production work to define the lore and the story, you'll see things change sometimes during production when you realize, like, this is a detail that we'd all kind of internally assumed, but it would actually really help us build our content if we could do away with this, or if we could amend it in this way. And so ideally, I think you're going to get the best results if you can be, if you can know when to be flexible on those details, and when something is really important to hold on to. I like the mechanics of souls in the Pillars of Eternity series.
Right.
Is important because it explains a lot about the history of the world. It's very important to the central crit path conflicts of both games. And so and it's also the foundation of some of our basic combat classes. So letting the player understand sort of, look, this is how this world works, and this is what this stuff means, is important to a degree. So you put the stuff they really need to know on the crit path. If it's something they really, really need to know, you probably put it in at least 3 places so that you can make sure that the player is is not going to be surprised or blindsided by that information. But then you have to be comfortable putting the rest of it at the margins and letting players opt into engaging with it and exploring it, or just breezing past it if that's not really what they're here for.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent during the development process is writing the main storyline and all of this surrounding information, is it like an organic process, or do they happen on separate tracks, on separate teams? I just wonder how, is a one complete effort, or do you say, well, let's just prioritize the main story, and then I guess we can build all of this extra information on the side? How does that happen from a development perspective?
So at least in the games that I've been a part of, that is a lot of building that lore is part of pre-production. When you're doing, creating a lot of documentation on a lot of different aspects of your game, and that will include the crit path story, and also, lore about the setting, which is what you're describing, and also how, what are the mechanics and systems at play in our game, and, how do those work? What's combat like? What's our pipeline for creating areas and levels, for creating, art and, character assets, all these different things. And so, yes, you do want to at least have, a lot of the basics figured out in that pre-production phase, because once you move into production and everyone's, your team is creating content, you do want to have as many of those questions about, well, how does this work in the world, answered. Like, how does this work in the world? This major event that shaped the setting, when did that happen, and where did it happen, and how did it affect these people? Obviously, the more that you have figured out, the less your production process, for individual, designers and writers is going to be slowed down by, finding answers that you don't already have. But again, that during production is when you also need to be flexible and realize, like, okay, well, is this bit of lore, or is this story point we've all been holding on to, is it actually, helping us create a more, cohesive, consistent, and, engaging experience for the player, or is it something that's holding us back? And, be willing to evaluate and, reassess a story point or lore detail if necessary.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Hello. Have you ever tried a buckwheat pillow? I have. I've been using a buckwheat pillow from Hello for about 9 months now, and the Hello pillow is absolutely fantastic. It's great because it's a lot like a beanbag. It molds to your head and neck, giving you just the right amount of support, and it stays cool throughout the night because buckwheat breathes better than things like feathers or foam. I don't have to fold it in half either to get the right kind of support that I want. And I don't get uncomfortable in the middle of the night. I don't find myself wanting to flip over the pillow to find the cool side of the pillow. And if you don't like the thickness of your Hello pillow, it's easy to just remove some of the buckwheat shell fillings inside and get it exactly the way you want. Although I've got a standard pillow and I've never removed anything from it because it was already perfect the way it came. But you can also take that filling out and throw it in a bag for a little while you wash the case as well. It's just super convenient. Buckwheat pillows have been used for centuries by all sorts of people. They have been used in Japan extensively and remain relatively popular to this day. You can even find them on really fancy pillow menus at some hotels, which is pretty cool. Hello is made in the United States of all natural filling. They're not plucked bird feathers in there or a petroleum-based product. It's a quality construction and quality materials. And its certified organic cotton case is cut and sewn for durability, and the buckwheat is grown and milled right here in the United States. Okay, so here's the deal. Sleep on a Hello pillow for 60 nights, and if Hello isn't for you, you can just send it back and they'll give you a refund. Go to hellopillow.com/dialogue to learn more. If you try more than one pillow, you get a discount of up to $20 per pillow, depending on the size that you buy. It's also got fast, free shipping on every single order. And 1% of the profits are donated to the Nature Conservancy. So again, that URL to go visit and let them know that you heard about them here on Dialogue is hellopillow.com/dialogue. That's HULLO pillow.com/dialogue. Our thanks to Hello Pillow for their support of Dialogue. I wanted to ask you, since you're also a novelist, and we'll talk a little bit about your books in a little while, but I wanted to ask you how game narrative writing differs from other kinds of writing that you've done, such as short stories and novels. I mean, it just strikes me as a very different process, not just because it's collaborative, but just by virtue of the way games work. It just strikes me as very different than those.
Yeah, definitely. So, obviously, working on a novel is, what you're putting on the page is really all about the story. It's all about the, character arcs and development and, writing prose that's going to be beautiful and evocative for the reader. But when you're writing a game, there, as you said, there are other considerations you have to keep in mind. And some of that may be, novels and short stories obviously have exposition as well. But, what exposition do we need to deliver to the player to make it, clear to them what they need to do next, or to inform them about, something they're going to encounter later in the game. And then there are also, the limitations and constraints of, the system you're working in, the engine you're working in, the style of game you're making, the sorts of actions the player can take both, in dialogue and also in the game world are inherently limited. And so, you want to make sure when you're writing that what you're writing obviously builds on, what the player can do well in the game and doesn't, suggest or promise things that the player cannot do. So, that's certainly part of it. It's interesting when I'm working on both, novel or short story projects and also game projects. I feel like it's always this push and pull because, the game writing is very collaborative, and there are moments when I think, man, I really wish I could just do what would be best for the story and not worry about the rest of this. And then there are moments when, I'm working on a novel and thinking, man, I really just wish I had a set of constraints, to help keep me focused and keep me on track. Because constraints can actually be a wonderful thing to help you build a story, build anything around, really.
Sure.
Handing someone a blank piece of paper and saying, write something good is a lot harder than saying, okay, so, write a story about this.
And I guess one of the differences between writing a novel and writing for narrative for a video game is when you have a game that allows the player to make a decision. So you end up with decision trees and branching story paths. How does that work from a narrative design perspective and accounting for all these multiple options that the player can choose from? How does that work when writing the narrative?
So that's definitely another argument in favor of good pre-production and good documentation, so that especially your your big story beats, where those are going and what the major decision points are for the player. Because, in RPGs like the ones we make, players certainly expect to be able to have a certain amount of influence over the world and the events of the game. But it is obviously very easy for that to get out of control and to become, expensive to faithfully iterate upon. And to be honest, it's also very easy to get into sort of this sort of designer mentality as opposed, where you're thinking like, here's this beautiful architecture I've built, this, the set of choices the player can make, and these points of, double crossing and triple crossing, and, all these moments where the player can make an interesting choice about how to progress their story or this particular quest. But those things are not always obvious to players, and so you may be building this extremely expensive and, very potentially buggy set of branching choices and decisions that the player's not even going to realize are there. If you're not building something where the player recognizes they're making a choice, and where the player is making a choice that is, relevant to their character and, to the experience they're having in the game, well, then what's the point? So yeah, it is really hard. And I think, part of it is about, planning well up front about, where you can afford to branch and how far out you can afford to branch. Yeah.
And have you ever found yourself sort of having a favorite path or like an option that you were personally hoping that the player would choose?
Sure. I mean, I guess so. Yeah. There are always things you put in, to particular dialogues, and I feel like it's the small option, the small character focus moments that I get the most excited about, where you think, players are going to have any number of, different stats or a different, set of companions with them, or just a different way they progress through this conversation. And so, most people will probably never see this particular option, but someone will, and it'll be great. And, invariably, you can definitely look around and see people engaging with those little bitty moments that you put in, because it's like, well, yeah, I mean, there's a big audience playing this game and someone's going to find it. I think one of the things I was, very excited about was writing Aloth's, return in Deadfire. There's a moment where, you can kind of, he's pretending to be someone he's not in front of a group of other people, and you can kind of needle him and, force him to, tell his fake backstory a little bit more, and he's very embarrassed by it. And so, I wrote that definitely hoping like, okay, I really hope, players embarrass him and, force him to divulge all these details, because then there's a little bit of reactivity to, the choices the player made when they're talking with him later about that. So that's always fun.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. And I also wanted to know about, in terms of planning ahead and in pre-production, is the DLC design process and expansion packs, is that part of the conversation in pre-production, and sort of knowing, okay, we're going to save some elements for the future expansion, or for we want to do a DLC, and we're going to save bits of this story and these characters or these cutscenes for not the game that will ship, on launch day, but for a future expansion. Is that part of the conversation in pre-production too?
I would say, at least in my experience, there is, a conversation up front about, like part of the conversation about the scope of the project is also, what, how many DLCs are we doing? Are we doing DLCs? And, if you have a publisher, obviously that may be something that, you're signing on to do with them. And so that's, an upfront expectation. Or if you're doing, a Kickstarter campaign, like, we did for the Pillars games, that may be something that you're adding in as a stretch goal perhaps. And then, again, it's also like, okay, yes, well, this is something we've agreed to do, so we're doing it. I've never heard the conversation take place, though, in terms of saying, oh, let's let's not do this thing here in the base game and let's instead, pull it out, put it in the DLC. You do hear like, oh, save it for the DLC or save it for the sequel is kind of something that people say when it's like, oh man, I wish we had, the time and the schedule to do this right now, but we don't. But no, the way I've seen, DLCs develop is more, it kind of like there's a structural question about, what kind of DLC is it? Obviously, like, is this, a kind of a standalone story module? Is this, a set of adventures that we want to let the player hop into? And, where in the game is that entry point? Is it as early as possible and then, open up until the very end of the game, which is, I think, something you see very often so that, people can, engage with that DLC content no matter how far along they are in the crit path. Or is it something where, no, you access this DLC content at a very specific moment in time? And so that's, those questions are obviously going to help you define the, the particulars of the DLC that you're making. But yeah, it's not so much well, let's pull this thing out of the base game and instead, do it in a DLC or some other sort of add-on content. It's more, okay, here's where this DLC needs to fit in the game. Here's our constraints, our team size, our budget, etc. One thing that's actually really cool is getting to see a DLC team really engage with the strengths of a game that, everybody already at this point has some experience with, like, as a DLC team is generally going to be starting with, you have your engine, you have all your tools, and you have all the things that are sort of in progress during production, more or less figured out. And so, that team is a lot freer to say, okay, this is what we know works really well about our content. And, these are the things where maybe we haven't done so well. So we can, dig into the strengths and take some interesting risks with this content. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Carrie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about tools because, for me and Federico, when we write, all we do is open a text editor and start to go. And I've got to assume that the tools that you use for game narrative are a little bit different than that and probably custom to Obsidian Entertainment. But what kind of tools do you use to work on a game?
So I'm definitely very fortunate at Obsidian that we have a tools department led by Dave Simchek, and they've been working on the dialogue editor that we use for probably about 10 years. So,
oh wow!
He and I actually gave a talk at GDC this past year on it. I believe it's up in the vault now, but yeah, it's custom built around letting us write branching dialogue that has scripting integrated for a variety of different RPGs. So what it looks like when you're working in it is sort of a flowchart tree that moves from left to right and top to bottom, and you place branches, you place a sequence of nodes that this is what an NPC is saying, and then other nodes where, okay, and now this is where the player can choose to say one of these things. And, we can script those so that, maybe some of them are only available as reactivity to something that may or may not have happened elsewhere in the game. Or, maybe some of them are tied to, maybe you have some very aggressive responses or some very kind-hearted responses, and those are scripted to build the player's reputation in the world as an aggressive or a benevolent person. So yeah, it looks like a flowchart. You could, so it's very easy to see the structure of the dialogue you're working with, which is very important, especially when you get to some very large NPCs like faction heads and companions are always going to be some of your biggest. And then we can write directly into those nodes. And so, yeah, those nodes themselves function like teeny tiny little text editors. So you can write the dialogue directly in there, edit in that node. We do, I believe most, if not all of the writers at the company have the practice of writing directly in the dialogue nodes. And I mean, if you're just used to, writing in traditional text editors, it does take a little bit of getting used to, but it's not actually that bad. And personally, I feel like it's a very good practice to have to write directly in that dialogue editor, because I think it gives you a greater sense of, how wordy you're being, of how much space you're taking up for the player in the dialogue that you're writing, and what the flow and pacing
Sure.
is going to be from node to node. And I think if you're writing in a Word document and then trying to paste it in later, I think it is easier to lose a sense of that flow, which is really important to making the dialogue feel good for the player.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because it feels a little bit like mind mapping or outlining, basically,
Yeah.
where you get a visual sense for exactly how big your topics are and how they fit together, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's actually something that we'll a lot of times write these dialogues in phases, and we may have like a stub pass or a rough pass that is basically just like you're saying, that outline where you're figuring out what's the overall shape of this experience for the player, and what are the things that we absolutely need to convey to them, and what are the things that need to happen or maybe could happen over the course of this conversation. And then you'll maybe have another pass after that where you're like, okay, I've got the basics, I've got the shape and the structure, and now I'm going to flesh it out with some good character focused writing.
Does that tie back into the rest of the game? So I guess what I'm wondering is, when you write a particular node and a player makes a choice, and that impacts how the game will unfold for them after that. Does the dialogue tool that you're using tie back into something that the programmers or other people in the process are looking at, or is it kind of more of a standalone thing?
So yes, we can. And I believe, tell me if I'm misunderstanding your question. Yes, we can integrate scripting through the dialogue editor. So that means, yes, if there's a choice that the player has made and we want to have NPCs react to it,
Right.
that's something we do very frequently. Yes, yeah. So you may have, you hit this big story beat already, or hey, you killed this NPC over here. Well, the conversation that you have with this other NPC is going to play out differently now, or that's, what happened is going to be acknowledged somehow. So yes, we can both implement that scripting in a way that reflects on choices that were already made or things that have already happened. And
Right.
we can also place variables that will, create events that will be reacted to later. So it could be, you chose this very aggressive, attack with this particular NPC, and, they won't talk to you anymore. And so now somewhere else, someone else in the game world is going to recognize that and call it out, or something else is going to happen as a result. And so the scripting system that we have in the dialogue editor is, it's also what level designers are, using in the game engine. So, it's a host of scripts, and I guess the ones that we end up using the most often in the dialogue editor will be, either custom scripts that will, maybe track a reputation or check for the presence of a companion to see if, they can interject into the conversation. Or we'll have, custom created global variables that we might create, per NPC or per quest or around any other piece of content. And it can be as simple as like, a very common one is, what is the state of this NPC? And 0, which is always the default, is you've never met them. 1 is you've met them. And so that may, affect that conversation, so that when you return to that dialogue tree, you're not hopping back into the first node, you're hopping into the next one. Another number, maybe they're dead. So, we track if they've died, and then, can use that variable to react to their death in the game world.
Right. It's interesting to me because it strikes me as kind of a programmatic approach to writing, where it's just another higher level of abstraction from the programming that's happening for the game. And it ties all back in eventually to exactly what's happening on a programming level with the characters and the story.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you too about, you've got obviously a big team for these games. How do you keep the narrative consistent with all those different people involved with different points of view and so forth? Is that hard?
It is. And obviously, like, with anything, the bigger a team is, the more content you can create, but also the easier it is for folks to, kind of hear one thing and take it in different directions. I mean, I think, one thing that helps is, obviously a good system of review and oversight from your project's leadership, making sure that you have leads who are, in a position to review content as it's being created and to catch anything that's inconsistent or anything that might, create or suggest a problem further on down the line, to catch that stuff early so that it can be corrected before a lot of content is built around it. And to look at content that then is, also mostly complete and make sure that it's still on the right path. That's part of it. I do think also the way you organize and loop in individual creators on teams is very important. On Deadfire, we basically had a writer's, and on the first pillars as well, actually, a writer's room where almost all the narrative focused people were in an office together. And so, on the one hand, then it was very easy for us to communicate with each other and to be on the same page. And if one person is having a conversation, we're all kind of a part of it. And so we have a very good idea of what's going on and a very good, common understanding of what's happening in our game. But then on the other hand, that means we're not as physically present with, artists and level designers, which means that, that may be instead where they're different, where it's easier for understandings to break down. If someone's saying, oh, I created this asset here, or I'm drafting this quest based around this set of assumptions, then, you have to figure out are those assumptions consistent with what we're doing elsewhere in the game? And if not, is there an inexpensive way to keep what's good about what's being created, but then, sort of bring it in line with what we're doing elsewhere and keep it consistent. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a real struggle. I think the biggest things though are just good documentation. Documentation seems to have a way of becoming obsolete on any project at a certain stage. Once the pace of creation, picks up to a certain pace. Good oversight from project leadership to help course correct when something's veering off in the wrong direction. And then, just a team that communicates very well, that's, present with each other, that's present at each other's meetings, and, can therefore sort of build the same understanding together. I'm more often than not, I think it turns out to be, if there's a question about, well, who else should be, part of this meeting, who all should we loop in to discuss this content, more inclusive tends to be better than less inclusive, because it just ends up being a very effective way to make sure that everybody is on the same page, and that everyone's kind of building the same thing together.
So, what is the editing process like? Do you ever revise the narrative based on playtesting, or is it more based on getting feedback during meetings from leadership? How does it look like for you when you need to make changes to the work that you already put in?
Sure. So yeah, most often, what'll happen is you'll have tasks based around creating content to a certain degree of completion. And ideally, there's an iterative property to, these different tasks that you have. So, the first task might be, come up with a paper design for, this companion's quest, or, this side task that we're putting somewhere. And so then, you have your document that says, here's what happens here. Here are all the points of complexity. Here are all the, asset requirements, all the things we need to pull this content off. And, your team as a whole, the team of people who will be building that content, as well as, the leads overseeing the project, will look through that and either say, yes, this looks good, or, this is something to change. And then you can, hopefully make that change before you've started, building, writing, or scripting anything around it. So then at the next stage, you'll have, for the writing at least, maybe a first pass character, or even a fairly complete character, where you say, okay, here's the character, here's, they fit into the quest, here's the information they're giving the player, here's kind of the story they're telling the player. And, at some point, your leads will look at that, come back with some notes for you about, and a lot of it's about how does someone who didn't create this content experience it? I think it's very easy with any kind of creation to sort of defend what you're doing as, well, here was my intention, or, well, here's what I was trying to do with this content. But what matters so much more than that is, okay, but how is someone experiencing it? And so honestly, whether it's a lead or, someone else you're working with on your team, or, someone from a different team who's playtesting your content, any of those people, it is so useful to have someone else step in, look at your content, and just show you how they reacted to it and how they played it, and what was clear to them and what was engaging to them. And obviously some of that is going to differ based around personal tastes, but clarity, for instance, is something where if you're seeing someone say, oh, I didn't like this NPC because I didn't think his jokes were funny. Well, then, okay, maybe ask around and see if this is something you're hearing a lot, or see if, well, this just wasn't to this person's taste. But if you've got someone who comes back to you and says, I didn't like this NPC because I didn't understand what I was being asked to do, or I didn't like this quest because it told me to go here and I went here and then nothing happened. Well, that's showing that either something is broken or you haven't really been clear with the player, and that's definitely something to revisit and reevaluate.
Yeah, that's interesting. Carrie, one of the things that I think is a thread through what we've been talking about a little bit, it relates a lot to what I've read a little bit about, which is the companion mechanic that you've got in the Outer Worlds that's coming out this fall. And what can you tell me about that companion mechanic? Because it's one of the aspects of that game that I'm most excited about as a player.
Well, I mean, so companions are they're a big part of a lot of the RPGs that we work on. Obviously not every RPG has companions, and companions even in RPGs that do have them may be a larger or smaller part of the experience. As a writer, there's some of the most fun and also the most challenging, tasks that you can work on in a game. Part of it is there is so much more content for them that there's going to be for any other kind of NPC in the game. Your companions, again, at least the way we do them, are almost always going to be the largest, because there's, oftentimes a quest around meeting them and recruiting them, and a quest that you'll do at some point with them to help show their personal growth and to help the player engage with them as people and with, the issues that they are sort of introducing the player to. You want them to be interesting and engaging individuals, and also, help introduce the player to, some of the larger thematic or story concerns in the game and in the setting. And, you want them to be reactive to the content that the player is experiencing. You want them to have opportunities to chime into conversations with other NPCs, to have banters and back and forths with each other, so that they really feel, like friends or crewmates, or, people who are joining you on this adventure and who are really there with you and reacting to the world, at the same time as you are. And not just sort of these drones that follow you around, attacking when you say attack. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of writing that goes into giving those conversations that much depth and also that much spread, because again, you're going to have some people who say, well, these two people are my favorites and I take them everywhere, and so I want to see them react. But you realize that, well, these two companions are also not going to be someone else's favorite. So I don't know when they're going to pop into the game for someone else. And I just have to make sure that, whenever the player recruits them and whatever adventures they bring them along for, that they, that what they're saying makes sense, and that they're, they are reacting believably to the world around them and, feeling like real characters.
All right, Federico, I think that's a good place to stop for today. I think next week we'll dive right in with Carrie and talk about her novels, the Recoleta series. I want to thank our two sponsors for this episode, Astropad and HealthView, and we will see you next week with another episode of Dialogue. Talk to you later, Federico.
Ciao, John.